Dune, a rather old and well-established setting, undoubtedly close to the heart of many a sci-fi or fantasy enthusiast. A world that is significantly older than yours truly, created in the heyday of early fantastical stories. Having such an extensive history and a significant long-time following, dare I say it might be among those works of literature that people seldom take a long hard look at to see what works and what doesn't, and everything is accepted as written by virtue of its age. However, I'm not here to untangle the sprawling setting presented in the books, as we've recently had a new movie to possess, well, some of the first one. I'm going to take a look at the world of Dune through the lens of this film. I have not read the books, nor do I intend to in the foreseeable future, regardless of the fact that some things I have an issue with might be adequately explained or countered there. It's on the movie to present me with the information I need to contextualize and understand elements of the story and world. I do not expect everything to be fully explored within a limited runtime, naturally, so I'll make sure to denote a lack of information as just that, not an inherent flaw. The reason I did not read the book prior to writing the script is because every film that is not a sequel, prequel, or in some way part of the continuity of another should be capable of standing on its own when put under scrutiny. I am fully aware that this story is not complete and that a part 2 is coming. However, I cannot judge this one based on the potential of what the next one might be. This is meant to be an evaluation of the world building done in Dune 2021, not the entire franchise. With all that being said, at certain points I am going to refer to information not found in the movie, but available in the books. These might be either positive or negative remarks, but I wish to be fair. Whenever I bring up something of the sort, I'll be sure to highlight that and consider it in isolation. Although that does mean I'm going to criticize certain aspects of the written material, which are relevant to select scenes or events in the movie. Some extremely major things that have the potential to fundamentally break the world, and I'm prepared to fully explore the reasons behind that. Based on everything I've said so far and the title of the video, you might be already aware that I'll be solely focusing on world building, that is the nuts and bolts that make up the setting. While there is a lot to talk about, the occasionally clunky dialogue, rush plot lines, as well as impressive visuals and great acting, I consider this subject to be my specialty, and hopefully I'll be able to highlight things others have not mentioned before, or at the very least go more in depth. I call this video a critique, which means I do aim to mix in positives with the negatives, but I refrain from mentioning anything that is only adequate or alright. What do I mean by that? Well, for an easy example, take the ceremony scene. We get an idea of the technology, customs, a few factions, mannerisms, places and politics. These are provided to us in a natural way, as opposed to an artificial exposition dump, where the characters do not act like they should, which is good, but there is nothing particularly exceptional about these elements. Cool is a very subjective value, and this is but regular information, something we need to know, but nothing that oozes creativity and ingenuity. It is a case of these things exist, while an impressive piece of world building would also highlight as to why these exist, how integral, useful or well thought out they are, perhaps even hinting at how what missing these elements might be. While this might seem a bit abstract at first, I think you'll better understand this metric once I've listed a couple of the excellent bits. Dune 2021 is a 2.5-hour monstrosity, and a baffling amount of lore is passed on to us. In order to make this as cohesive as possible, I try and fit everything I want to talk about into categories. Quite a few categories in fact. I'll mention spice, verms, military and weaponry, the Bene Gesserit, the Fremen and tools of the desert, the ecology of Arrakis, vehicles and transport, everyday technology, and last, but definitely not least, shields. Naturally, I will not go through the events of the movie in chronological order, as information on a certain thing is often sprinkled throughout. Also, since Warner Brothers is particularly sensitive about anyone using clips of their movies, I refrain from those to a degree, providing relevant screenshots instead, when possible. I know it's not as visually appealing, but I doubt you are here for spectacle anyway. With this long-ass intro being done though, let the exploration begin. I chose spice as the first subject as it is both integral to the whole world, and my critique of it is pretty simple. If for some reason you are watching this video without knowing anything of Dune, spice is a sort of mineral mixed in with the sand of the desert planet Arrakis. It induces hallucinations, provides health benefits, and makes interstellar travel possible, or at the very least provides a viable alternative, as humanity had to somehow get here in the first place. By the movie's own words, it is the most valuable substance in the known universe by far. There begins my criticism, as I sure as hell could have been fooled. Arrakis is presented as a backwater planet with very few settlements and inhabitants beyond the natives, who use spice to their own ends rather than selling it. There is one house, with as far as we know a single city, sending out a few combines into the desert to harvest spice, then ship it off-world. This is completely at odds with how valuable spice is presented to be. That value is practically inconceivable to us, a material significantly more precious than anything else in the known universe, with a single planet where it can be mined. I find it extremely hard to believe that an advanced spacefaring civilization that relies on spice to stay connected would care so little about Arrakis. There should be hundreds, if not thousands of cities, sprawling rich metropolises that control waves of harvesters, satisfying the demand while getting rich themselves. The reason only one house is permitted to gather the resource, and why they do not even try to expand their operation, is beyond me. Now, the very simple justification of the Emperor wanted it this way is something that might come up as a counterpoint, but that makes the Emperor a bloody idiot, doesn't it? Exploiting the riches of the planet to a reasonable, or hell, even unreasonable degree would not only provide interstellar travel to more people, it would also help keep the prices low, which he himself would benefit from, both in terms of possible taxation and the spice his own fleet and people would need. Not only that, but granting more than one family to keep sucking on Arrakis and growing fat like a tick of unchecked power and influence. It would balance out differences among the leading class of the Empire. A smart person would see the planet as not only a source of spice, but also an opportunity to shape the politics of the great houses, controlling who can get a slice of the cake, leveraging this incredible privilege to enforce his will. But no, he doesn't give two shits about this opportunity, he just wants to kill a few people with a blatantly transparent plot. Indeed, instead of doing this on a different planet, one that is not the sole source of the most important resource of the entire universe, or rather than granting the Atreides the opportunity to harvest beside the Harkonnen, he decides to screw over everyone in his childish attempt at intrigue. He mandates the Harkonnens to move off-world, halting spice production for who knows how long, demands the Atreides to move in, and expects them to begin gathering the priceless resource with the equipment the previous operation left behind, but only for a bit, right up until the Harkonnen manage to enact their plan and kill the Atreides, after which the Baron's people would have to transport everything back to Arrakis and get the collection going once again. All this time without the most valuable resource in the known universe by far would risk an economic recession, if not outright an empire-wide crisis. And to what end? Get the Atreides away from their home planet? I doubt this was the only place to send them, or that ignoring the famous "the spice must flow" rhetoric that's part of this very setting was the only way to achieve this. You could not argue that they were off guard either, as they were expecting sabotage and attacks all the same. The woefully underdeveloped betrayal was the only reason they were vulnerable. The Harkonnen were more preoccupied with busting up the means of production, rather than the impressive defenses of the city. The same means of production they were planning on using themselves once the whole ordeal is done. Saying that this was done to exempt the Emperor of any potential culpability and suspicion is laughable as well. Consider the optics of telling a house to move out of a place in favor of another. Then the newly moved house gets obliterated under mysterious and totally unexplainable circumstances, followed by the previous house moving back in and resuming business as usual. Not only that, but with such a massive city, futuristic technology, interstellar travel, and the fact that this is the planet with, I repeat, the most valuable resource in the known universe by far, there is no chance that information would not get out of the attack. It would be difficult to blame the Fremen for orbital bombardment, and the Emperor's personal branded forces loudly chanting their name. Also, it is mentioned that if other houses found out about what the Emperor did, then a civil war would follow. So maybe don't be so fucking obvious about your crane drawing of a plan. That's what I had to say about spice, which was directly linked to the whole premise. It's kind of bored, as it means that either the writers did not think all this through, or the Emperor, and to a certain degree both great houses, are woefully incompetent. Pick your poison, I guess. With that aspect done, let's move on to another prominent feature of the setting that is kind of the poster child of the franchise. I'm not going to lie, I really like giant worms regardless of the setting, but that is a subjective opinion, and this is an objective evaluation. Unfortunately, they are rather dysfunctional as creatures go. Now, we get to know very little about the physiology and anatomy of the sandworms, and as I've stated before, a lack of information is not a flaw in and of its own. Therefore, things like how such a massive creature can adequately supply its entire body with its own brand of blood or oxygen, and how it is not crushed under its own incredible weight, I'm not going to question. There are quite a few elements I can comment on though. Since I have yet to mention a positive, I'll begin with one thing that might be great world building. Might be because I am uncertain whether this is the case, but I'll present my theory nonetheless. The massive size of the worms compared to anything else on the planet draws a connection to whales. Since there is nothing on the surface of the desert that could dream about hoping to one day maybe provide the calories equal to what is burned every second by the worm, I must assume that it is sustained by what is beneath the sand, which either means masses of lesser creatures that are sustained by spice, or spice itself. Like the krill of the ocean, both of these could potentially fuel the beasts, and given that spice extends the life of humans, it is safe to assume that it does provide energy. This is speculation only, but if correct, I have to applaud the teeth. Instead of stubby little spikes so commonly depicted for such monsters, these seem to be reminiscent of balines, the teeth of certain whale species used to trap small animals in their mouth. If it was indeed the designer's intention to have these implements filter through the sand and either separate the spice from it or catch lesser beings, then it is a very clever idea, making sandworms a little bit more feasible. What's more, the extreme friction and overall pushing force these teeth would have to endure makes me conclude that they are, indeed, extremely good of a material to make blades out of. So a bonus point for Chris knives too. Of course, it is arguable that a long serpentine, highly mobile body is the most effective at catching sand krill or harvesting the rather stationary food source of spice, but that's where my criticisms begin. Sand is not water, regardless of how it is portrayed in the movie. It is not a liquid, but a mass of small solid bits. Therefore, one cannot swim in it. If we take a look at fossorial animals on Earth, we see that even the largest ones are relatively small, and they usually just dig their holes instead of constantly traversing the subterranean ecosystem. Sure, a huge number of worms do live exclusively in the soil, but at their size it is a rather different experience. They need to move particles of the soil only a tiny bit, condensing the empty space in between, rather than moving massive volumes of earth apart. They also move rather slow, as this is not a quick process. The largest known earthworm is the African giant earthworm, with the record-holding individual almost reaching 7 meters in length, but others like the giant Gippsland earthworm or the Oregon giant earthworm can also reach 1 meter. However, when looking at these images, it is also important to note that the animals are capable of contracting or expanding their body, potentially making them appear larger than they actually are. This peristaltic motion helps them move and create their tunnels, exerting a surprising amount of force. However, the larger they get, the harder it is to move through sturdier terrain. These sizes are incomparable to the 400-meter monstrosity in the movie, and unless there is some extreme borderline magical adaptation, it cannot possibly move the way it is portrayed to. Based on humans interacting with the sand of Arrakis, it appears to be ordinary earth sand, yet the worms just slide through it with ease, pushing several hundreds if not thousands of tons of matter around them, reaching extreme speed with seemingly nothing propelling them forward. This latter part is the most egregious of these offenses to realism. When one looks at a snake, worm, or maybe even a snail, it is easy to assume that they just move forward. But if one takes just a second to think, it becomes evident that that is impossible. There is no creature that proceeds forward without any propelling force. Now let's assume for a second that under the sand there's stuff going on to facilitate movement, we just cannot see it, but only to move on to another problem: friction. It is difficult to even imagine the rolling force of coarse, rough and irritating sand constantly chipping away at the skin of the worms. The generated heat, the constant damaging effect, and the sheer power with which it will obstruct the worm's movements makes the animals practically self-destruct above a certain size. Well below 400 meters, mind you. But I'm going to be generous and say that the worms have some bullshit indestructible skin that is heat resistant, which handwaves 2 of the 3 problems related to that. Well, let me introduce one more: breathing. Since our worms are not anaerobic bacteria, it is safe to assume that they need oxygen to survive. Now, regularly sized subterranean worms have access to a sufficient amount of air, or water in the case of aquatic ones, as Earth is not a solid condensed block, like I've previously mentioned. Their needs are satisfied via the small crevices, pockets and cavities within the soil, even in the case of sand, as some species do live in aquifers, riverbanks and the like. The beasts of Arrakis, however, are entirely different. Imagine being buried in the sand and trying to take a deep breath. Now imagine that the size of sand particles is more akin to that of flour. Now also imagine that your body is extremely long and now you need multiple times the amount of oxygen you did before. Yep, those worms would drown. They could not even do what aquatic mammals or reptiles do and take deep breaths occasionally and submerge. Why? Instead of swimming around in an easy-to-reverse medium, they need to exert an incredible amount of force to scrape against the desert sand. Just a bit of air here and there would definitely not suffice. To our current knowledge, life cannot exist without water, not in forms similar to the animals we know. As a result, we have to assume sandworms also consume lakes of water every day. Now, for reasons I'll get into later, we have to conclude there is a massive amount of groundwater at certain depths, so this demand is easily satisfied, if justified right. However, water is not the only thing under the sands. When massive amounts of this material are collected in an area, the immense weight the upper layers place on the depths generates sandstone, a much harder, structurally more stable form of matter. From numerous establishing shots, we can see that this is indeed the case on this planet as well. There is bedrock. Good. Not for the worms though. If you thought sand was hard to burrow through with such an immense body, sandstone is just a brick wall, making that traversal impossible. Indeed, in this scene we can see that anyone standing on a hard surface is safe from the monsters. Now, I originally aimed to criticize this aspect of the movie, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that they did a good job with this. The Fremen can mostly be found around such rocks, hiding among the crevices or hanging out in massive derelict buildings. Additionally, while it is difficult to gauge what this shield wall actually is, if it is indeed just a huge slab of concrete that is dug deep into the ground, no wonder sandworms do not threaten the city. This defensive strategy is also hinted very subtly throughout, so props for whoever thought of this. Unfortunately though, I'm not done with the negatives, or neutrals for that matter, as this point is kind of a weird one that I cannot really categorize. So we have established that the worms must eat either krill or spice. If these 400-meter titans try to live off of the few mice or the odd beetle in the desert, they would starve. As a result, it is a weird thing that they are drawn to rhythmic noises, and even as much as a footstep can attract them. If we assume that nothing as big as a human strode the desert before colonization, this all might be a weird evolutionary quirk, or the way mating worms would find each other, although that latter conflicts with the whole eating the thumping thing mentality. They might also find large nests of krill through this method, and those being rather small entities, it is fair to assume humans and harvesters would also attract them. However, this presents an incredible weakness to be exploited, either by drawing worms to a specific locale to murder them with artillery, or simply mortally exhausting them by thumping all over the place constantly. They are easily exterminated. Now, There are numerous arguments to make for why you would not want to genocide the entire species. Going after my own heart, chief among them would be the unpredictable and massive impact it would have on the ecosystem, and simply the fact no one should have the right to mark a creature for extinction unless their own extinction is at stake. And even then, what a loss. In the actual lore though, it is clear the Fremen hold great reverence for these beings, while other humans are likely motivated by financial and political incentives, keeping the spice harvesting hazardous to dissuade others from trying. This latter is a shitty reasoning in and of its own, but try to tell that to the workers who probably have quite a mortality rate. Either way, it is difficult to evaluate this aspect. I know it is mostly there for narrative purposes, as the odd worm showing up here and there for no reason would not be as satisfying as having clear mechanics, but I personally would have preferred this to be explored more. A line in an educational material would have sufficed. As I've said though, this is just a remark, not a flaw. Shields are linked to the rhythmic noise conundrum though, and in a bad way. I will take a closer look at these devices later on, but one drawback they have is that worms are attracted to them and are sent into a frenzy when in close proximity, as evidenced by this subtitle and the fact that an orbital attack is only made possible after this act. The shield wall, even if it stops worms the way I proposed, also projects the force field kind of shield. These beasts appear all over the place, drawn by noises and the like, even outside of so-called worm territory. I struggle to believe that a city-sized bubble would not be a massive beacon for the animals while also making them extremely aggressive. Even if they can't get in, it would be a massive noodle party at the gates 24/7. But for some reason, it doesn't work like that. The argument that this is a different design is weak as well due to the conversation the ecologist and Paul have about why they don't shield harvesters. Thing is, narratively speaking, combined shields are moot anyway. Unless the harvesters project a shield several sizes their own, they would still be gobbled up no problem, so that doesn't help. The only reason behind this shield drawback I can imagine is that it supposedly gives the Fremen a fighting chance against the Imperial forces, but it's not like that would not be the case with shields on. We'll get to the reason for that later. However, giving a meta reason for a piece of world building that creates problems elsewhere is not exactly stellar work. Speaking of not exactly stellar work, here's the Sandwalk. So it is odd that a rather rhythmic dance is supposed to throw off the worms, but alright, let's accept it does. However, this is one of those aspects where consistency is by far the most important thing in terms of world building. We get scenes, 2 to be specific, where we are explicitly told that you need to walk like this, as the worms will know you are there and come. There's all this setup, and we get a few seconds where they use it, and maybe a couple others where they might be, but the actors didn't really give a fuck. In every prior and subsequent scene, people are just walking normally, and there are no repercussions. Even in the scenes the Sandwalk comes up, worms are attracted by something else. Therefore, this is a piece of world building that is completely irrelevant, wastes our time, and still manages to create an inconsistency. Granted, in some scenes it is obvious why they are not doing the rhythmic dance, but in others, it's just odd. They take the time to tell us Paul and his mom are entering worm territory, despite witnessing a worm a couple seconds prior to that. Yet for some reason their silly walk was unnecessary until that arbitrary line Paul somehow recognizes. I am rather confident this is something they included because it was in the book, but forgot to account for it. Then why draw our attention to it in the first place? It's not like it has any effect on the plot. Speaking of silly things that have no effect on the plot but create world-building problems, let's take a look at Verb Riding. We are explicitly told worms travel deep underground and are only drawn to the surface by noises and the like. As such, I'd expect the rider to be ground to a fleshy paste when the worm assumes its usual behavior instead of having the courtesy of just partially submerging. The counter-argument that the riders control the worms with their picks isn't really valid either. Unless the beasts have a hypersensitive skin, they won't even feel those tiny things, and if they do, boy would they have a bad time with friction. Also, instead of becoming fully subservient, animals tend to do something else when a thing makes them itch. The end result is a fleshy paste once more. This Verb Riding thing, which to me seems like the definition of the rule of cool, could only work if the riders actually might control the monsters or tame them in some way, but that creates problems elsewhere. If it is indeed possible to steer or even command these worms, why are they not used in combat? Most of the Fremen seem to be fully opposed to the idea of imperial presence on the planet to a point where they actively wage war on the intruders. If they had access to these kaiju level beings, why are they not using any of them? There could be the cop-out answer of they are sacred, but that means they are too sacred to be used in defending their home, but not sacred enough to not be used as a vehicle. These seem a little dangerous to be the equivalent of bikes. Which brings me to the other point of Verb Riding. You wouldn't want to be doing that unless you have full control over the beast. Like, look at the last scene. That's woefully close to the non-sandwalking line of Fremen there, bud. Maybe it's not such a good idea to use a massive carnivorous and highly aggressive monster to hitch a ride home. You know, the place where your loved ones and stuff are. But you gotta admit, this is cool, right? No, it looks really stupid and I hate it, and I would dislike it even if it made sense. Phew. That was quite a meaty subject with lots to comment on. Time to move on to a fresh bit of the world though, military and weaponry. I'll include here tactics and objects, but will not mention shields, not yet. So let's begin with the most nitpicky thing. The hell is this dude doing on foot? He cannot use a shield, he won't defend the harvester standing out there in the open, it is debatable whether he can even scout, and when the worms inevitably come, someone will have to pick him up or he's dead. I know he's there to show off some cool gear, but maybe do that without making the Harkonnen look stupid. Speaking of Harkonnen stupidity, let's jump a bit in time. When the city is attacked, orbital lasers and bombardment is in full swing to begin with. Good. You want to shoot the shit out of the place and quickly circle it so no survivors can get out. Wait, I said circle it, what are you doing with those transport ships? Oh right, the classic big brain tactic of deploying melee infantry in the middle of a firefight to maximize casualties caused by friendly fire. Genius! It is bad enough melee infantry is a primary form of warfare in this universe, we'll get to that later, but to also lend them and do things like this. I wouldn't want to be on anyone's side really, this all just seems like indiscriminate massacre. Also, maybe landing the leader of your entire house in an active war zone where things like this are going on is not a good idea. Stupidity seems to be a consistent characteristic of the Harkonnen though, regardless of what the writers intended to portray. So they managed to paralyze a person of high value to gloat over. Unnecessary if you ask me, but whatever, the Baron seems to be aiming at ticking off every box on the evil bad guy character sheet, I guess. However, if you wish to stroke your ego in such a way, it is important to check the victim for any potential hidden weapon, like a bomb. Stripping them and surveying every crevice is a good idea. Not the mouth though, you don't want to be too thorough. I guess the Harkonnen security isn't paid by the hour as they failed to take a look at the teeth of soon-to-be dead. You know, the one body part he can still kind of move. Idiots. Let's see, what other moronic things did the Harkonnen do? Oh right, presumably they were the one to build this city. Or if not, they were the one to not address this issue for years, decades, or however long they've been there. The entire settlement has one very special room. It's the one where you set 3 guards with their shields turned off. Within there's a console, probably a single easy-to-use button to turn off, let's see, the shield defending the city, the internal communication of security forces, possibly even military connection. So I initially intended to include electricity in this list as well, although upon further inspection there is no citywide blackout. No, I was simply misled by the fact that none of the buildings we see from the inside have any lamps or lighting, which is extremely odd for a city built or at the very least used by people who were mostly active at night. Either way, let's return to the original problems. Yeah, you don't want those off buttons to be too far from each other with heavily armed guards around 24/7 and multiple failsafe mechanisms to stop one underdeveloped character from sacrificing thousands. I mean, it did benefit them in the end, but holy hell is this bad design. Speaking of bad design, I offer you the Hunter Seeker. It is an incredibly small assassin bot that loudly drills holes into walls instead of sticking it through open windows, is equipped with a camera so bad that makes it impossible to identify a human while standing in a hologram, and made of materials so weak that they can be crushed by hand. I can't stress enough how bad that thing is made. Like, picture a similar small device, say a USB drive or one of those old MP3 players. You really have to try to break those, and your hand would likely be busted in the process. Not for this presumably military-grade hardware though, it literally has the structural integrity of a mosquito. Add to this the fact that it has to be remotely controlled from close proximity. The drone pilot had to be walled in to be able to pull off this incredible feat. Its weird remote control technology regressed so much in the far future. Also, they could have given the poor soul a watch or something. He accidentally launched the assassination attempt in broad daylight instead of doing it in the dead of night, while Paul is sleeping and defenseless. Unless the Harkonnens were genius enough to set him up to fail and put everyone on high alert. Or the Hunter Seeker is so shitty it has no night vision. By the way, on the note of setting up to fail, why did they even attempt to murder one of the two people they were specifically told not to kill by the Bene Gesserit? Man, the movie doesn't really portray the Harkonnen as the sharpest tools in the shed. Now, there is an argument to be made about the fact that this scene chronologically takes place after the assassination attempt. However, if the Bene Gesserit did not approach the Harkonnen up to this point, that makes them the retards. Despite the fact that they have vested interest in Jessica and Paul and that they know about the plot, they waited until after the evil house tasked with murdering all Atreides had ample time to murder both of them. Countless times. It's not like they were stringed for time anyway, so I do not see why they would risk the exact thing that happened. Fortunately for them though, the Harkonnen used the worst possible tool for the job. While this is not related to military or tactics or any subject I intended to dissect, I must say I am really disappointed by the antagonists of the film. They are generic evil faction TM. They look evil. They live on an evil planet, they dress evil, they have evil mud baths, they have evil allies, they have evil pets, they speak an evil language. They kidnap and torture people to get others to do their bidding, and instead of keeping up their end of the bargain, they kill those who help them. Now, other than the stupidity the Harkonnen show, these evil characteristics are not necessarily faults. You can have stellar stories with obvious bad guys, although this woefully undermines any potential interest I had in the politics of this world, as having so clear-cut good and bad guys with few if any grey or opposite traits implies it is going to be incredibly superficial and predictable. I hope I'll be proven wrong about this, but the acting was the only thing that kept my interest for Harkonnen scenes. That's everything I've got for Warfare excluding shields, so we can move on to a couple brief remarks on the Bene Gesserit. Since it's been a while since I praised anything, let's begin with a compliment. I really like the scene, however short it is, where Paul and his mother talk about the prophecy and how the local populace has been exposed to it. Indeed, prophecies are chief among claims that cannot be proven or disproven, as they refer to a future we have yet to experience. Therefore, it is, for all intents and purposes, a form of propaganda. Regardless of whether there is any truth to the prediction or whether Paul is actually that special person, the perception of the masses can be cleverly manipulated. I am usually not a fan of notions like destiny in a story, as it removes a good bit of autonomy, and agency is very important when it comes to characters. However, these few lines hint that it is a distinct possibility that the prophecy is nothing but fabrication or a safe guess, and that fanaticism is cultivated around it purposefully. Without explicitly leaning one way or the other, doubt is sown. Now, it is debatable whether or not this is the case in the setting itself, as we don't have the necessary information. We do know some sort of divination or prediction exists, as Paul can see alternative futures. However, if prophecies are created in the same way, then it is a woefully unreliable method, and sprinkling these breadcrumbs, pointing at the fact that the information we are presented might be biased, really supports immersion. So much can be achieved with so little. This scene practically advises us not to take everything at face value, to think about what we are shown. It's unfortunate we cannot do that to many aspects of this very movie. My next criticism is a perfect example for this. Paul says the Bene Gesserit control the Empire from the shadows. Here's the thing, if it is common knowledge, it's not from the shadows now, is it? It's called politics. You sway people's opinions and decisions to make them more aligned with your goals. They can be manipulative as hell, sure. It's a perfect instance where a piece of world building, something only a few would be aware of, is not provided to us subtly by people who would be in on it, but a crystal clear sentence is badged into our face so our etherpid grey matter can understand it. To make matters worse, this is not even necessary to understand the story or motivations. We were already shown that these ladies hold political power and nothing else is needed to explain any event. By the way, I find it really odd that this sci-fi witch is permitted to just kill people without repercussions. I mean, she just landed and said that if Paul takes his hand out of the pain box, she is going to murder him in cold blood. Even if it is precaution, I don't think any of the great houses would take kindly to geriatric gods offing their members because they failed one test. I'd have guessed there are more civilized ways to keep dangerous people in check in the future. I mean, there are now. This crony boy is the sole heir to House Atreides for all we know. You'd think his death would lead to a bit of a kerfuffle, so maybe a threat of captivity would be enough. The future will have regressed in quite a few ways. Don't worry, the irony of this statement does not escape me. While we are on the subject of galactic sorceresses, I have one last thing to speak about. The voice, and specifically, I don't really understand why it is used so sparingly. It seems to be incredibly powerful, and it doesn't really have a significant cost on the part of the user. When Paul is challenged to a life and death duel, when you and your son are in grave danger because one or more people are literally in the process of murdering you, maybe use it? It's great for intimidation. A single sentence can kill a person, and there are very few ways to avoid it. The only explanation I can think of is a meta one, as Paul probably had to have a fight and murder a man for some narrative reason, but that kind of undermines the whole event. I mean, they joined the Fremen via deadly threat and murder anyway could have hastened the process a bit, while also eliminating any potential danger. This is an adequate time to segue to the other side of that conflict and discuss both the Fremen and various tools of the desert. This will possibly be the only section where I have more positive remarks than negative ones, as I find that writers of either the movie or more likely the books have put a lot of thought into them. Let's begin with what is praiseworthy about the people themselves. They have water and moisture based customs, as that is the most important resource for them. This just oozes immersion, hinting at how these people were molded by the conditions of the planet itself, transforming their culture to revolve around what truly matters there. Spitting, wasting moisture to show respect is impeccable world building. A simple motion anyone can do that actually represents a small shared sacrifice. It is unique and engaging, showing that the Fremen are not just native faction number 254 fresh out of the trope factory, but realistic people. That being said, this scene really shows the Atreides to be as moronic as the Harkonnen. Cal Aquaman here was dumb enough not to tell basic information of the Fremen, as maybe a universal sign of disrespect that is the exact opposite on this planet might be something of interest here. I guess he lost his smarts with his beard. He looks so weird like that. Why did they do it? I mean, this guy has a beard, this one too, so it's not a Fremen custom. It also probably helps against sunburn, and shaving is probably a real hassle out there in the desert. Anyway, every other Atreides in the room is also an idiot for not even asking for a briefing. But I digress. There are more positives to discuss. I also like how they treat bodies as a resource, as death can provide life-giving water. With futuristic technology, I imagine it's quite easy to drain the dead from every last drop of moisture. This also reflects a high level of realism. A hardy people for whom water is more important than mourning, it needs to be. That being said, I have issues with how this body was generated, and I'm not talking about the voice now. It is kind of a trope that tribalistic or nomadic societies, who are considered to be more barbaric and primitive, even by writers, have a combat-based hierarchy. Not only are we talking about the offshoot of an advanced spacefaring civilization, they are also obsessed with water. If they fight for everything, that's a lot of moisture lost due to sweating and agitation, essentially in vain. The strongest leader is not necessarily the wisest or best for the position, and that's something they should know. The Fremen are consistently portrayed to essentially live on a knife's edge, and this seems very wasteful and uncharacteristic of them. It works about as much as it does in Black Panther, which means it doesn't, not at all. Back to another compliment though, the palm tree scene is a wonderful example of natural world building. By natural, I mean that every bit of information is provided in a way that it would happen normally. Now this is not the only scene that does that, there are a couple. The previously mentioned ceremony was also of this kind, but this one deepens numerous aspects in a way that one doesn't. It shows plants that could not possibly survive without the attendance of the gardener. We are told they each drink 5 persons worth of water every day, which amounts to 100 lives. However, they are sacred to locals, including Fremen, and so that sacrifice is a must. It really highlights how something so wasteful as cultivating date palms on an inhospitable planet is still so crucial for those of this religion. This is especially meaningful when considered in context of water-based customs and how important moisture is shown to be for the locals. A religious symbol is considered to be well worth 100 lives, also emphasizing the avid beliefs of these people, which is perfectly in line with how fervent they are when it comes to the prophecy. While on the surface it is one major character talking to a very minor one, it does a lot of work to ensure verisimilitude. Even if it doesn't really lead anywhere, the information we are presented alters our perception of this world to be more in line with how we should see it. Big thumbs up from me. However, I've already been talking for quite a while about the Fremen. They are well developed and many of them seem to be in touch with Imperials. Yet the very first educational tape Paul listens to tells us around 2 sentences regarding the desert people and says that's about all the Empire knows. Bullshit. This cannot be true. As I've said, numerous Fremen live in the city on Dune. This lady here is a high-ranking person working for the Emperor. It took Quaquaman a bit of convincing and he already knows quite a lot about them. You mean to tell me that ever since Arrakis was inhabited, no one bothered to ask a question or two, or maybe take notes of what they see? There are rather expensive palm trees on public display with scores of Fremen worshippers around. This is one of those instances where I'm actively shown this is false information, yet it comes from an authoritative source. Either Paul is listening to some kindergartner level shit, or no, this is not an or, it simply is terrible educational material. It's actively misinforming people. Enormous thumbs down from me, and I must reiterate, so little can do so much. Alright, let's move on to the tools the inhabitants of Arrakis use designed to survive in this inhospitable place, most of which are quite excellent, I must say. They definitely go a long way for making such a harsh environment still viable, and I can see them as devices that would practically need to be invented. To mention the best examples, the tent is great, provides a shelter on a constantly shifting surface, preserves water and can be carried in a small pack. Now it does need the sand compactor to properly function, as finding yourself at the bottom of a dune is a surefire way to die. The steel suits follow a similar principle and are also great. Would they not exist, I'd have trouble believing anything could be done during the day. However, there seems to be a bit of an exposed part. I mean, try touching your eyes. They're wet, and your body fervently works at keeping it that way. Quite a huge loss of water there, especially since the sunlight would also hurt them, reducing visibility quite significantly. Additionally, you'd be pretty boned if a stray gust of wind blew heated sand into 2 of your most precious organs. If only there was a simple and efficient way to avoid that, maybe like a piece of hard matter that is transparent held around your head by some kind of strap. It could also be darkened to block out much of the sun. Maybe use rubber or some kind of padding too to make them fit seamlessly. I don't know. This seems like a rather intricate piece of equipment. Maybe they just don't have the technology. Jokes aside, I know they don't have goggles so that we can see their blue eyes. But again, meta answers are pretty bad for explaining intentional flaws in world building. To continue the list of items with good design, I'm a big fan of doing compasses justice. Most media treat the cardinal directions as constants across the universe, but we derive this information from the magnetic poles. Magnetic poles that are constantly in slow motion, the speed of which itself is a variable. While this defense is a boon for life on habitable planets, it's not even a prerequisite to any world. While in reality the magnetic north or south are relatively stable points that are great for navigation, I'd prefer if more settings took the time to do more than just copying what we have. Also, props for knowing that a relatively swiftly moving celestial body is not great for navigation, even if it is highly magnetic. Having mentioned the equipment I was impressed by, here comes my biggest criticism yet: the speed coffee machine. Firstly, disgusting. There's no reason not to use the stuff collected by your suit, you barbarians. Secondly, the heating, likely spilling, and the stuff that is left on the bottom of the cup is all lost moisture. Also, caffeine dehydrates. Why not drink some schnapps too while you're at it? I am being facetious to a degree, but I still find this piece of world building a bit strange and at odds with who the Fremen are shown to be. I mean, they literally squeeze every bit of water from their dead. I doubt they would do something so wasteful to drink something made from a plant that likely cannot be cultivated on the planet. Tea is a slightly better alternative, but still caffeine. Now, I'm only assuming that this is coffee, as it seems to be based on the little cups and the device, but there is every possibility it isn't that. If that is the case, my criticism is moot, but if I am right, it was not a good inclusion, I tell you that. Having thoroughly evaluated this crucial piece of kitchen appliance, let's proceed with our odyssey through the world building of this movie and arrive at quite a notable subject: the ecology of Arrakis. Water, an essential resource for life as we know it. The Dune planet cannot exist without it. We get a brief glimpse at the globe itself, and based on the information we are presented, it seems there is no water on the surface. No lakes, no rivers, no seas. That's not a deal breaker, the sun is incredibly harsh, those would dry up in an instant, so it makes sense all water is under the sand. I assume it is because it cannot be anywhere else and it must exist, as there is indigenous animal life. The worms and the krill, I hypothesize, would spend much of their time in the wet portion of the sand, in regions where spice is abundant, or even constantly generated. Indeed, we could in some way have spice be a renewable resource, as without primary producers, this planet is on a timer. Well, essentially Earth is on a timer too, courtesy of the sun, but Arrakis could very well be headed towards an extreme ecological catastrophe much sooner. It will happen once the majority of spice runs out. Granted, it could very likely take billions of years counting from the birth of the planet. Humans do accelerate that inevitability though. Either way, non-spice related primary producers seem to be missing. Primary producers are the living beings at the lowest end of the food chain, ones that harvest natural sources of energy and transform it in a way that can be utilized by them. To their misfortune, their consumers can also utilize their produce. On Earth, the vast majority of primary producers are plants and other photosynthetic organisms. We know for a fact that there is no plant life indigenous to Arrakis. We are told directly, so there's no argument to be made there. This means there is no reason to do anything on the surface, as there is nothing to eat or drink, only hot sand. Therefore, this beetle and this mouse are quite a conundrum. While the arthropod might be a remnant of ecological experiments performed in this facility, but it does beg the question how it managed to survive so long. No such luck for this little critter though. Now, it can be hypothesized that since spice still exists on the surface, some extremophilic specialized organisms adapted to the extreme heat of the day or cold of the night to harvest what little food is on the surface, in relative safety from the worms, out of their main hunting grounds. This mouse is practically the antithesis of that. The large ears and partial fur suggests it is designed for desert heat, but it is active at night. Night would be a time of very likely sub-zero temperatures, with no clouds, vegetation or anything really besides sand and sandstone. Even the extreme heat of the Arrakis day would escape the planet during the night, with the cold of space clawing its way back in. This animal is not equipped to endure that. Alright, let's say it is only active at dusk and dawn, which severely limits its chances for no apparent reason. The only food source it has is spice, unless it is some sort of predator which hunts creatures we have not seen. Either way, this build is made for high speed, and it also seems to be an extremely active animal with fast metabolism. In the case of a herbivore, this just doesn't congeal with the conditions of the desert. It burns up calories really fast, yet the exact reason any being would choose the surface as opposed to the depths would be to escape predators and competition, making a fast lifestyle an actual detriment here. Also, if it eats spice, I'd expect some sort of filtering mouth, maybe even a beak, not the visage of a rodent. Therefore, the only logical conclusion is that it is predatory with a prey that has a hard shell of some sorts that evolved to be quick. We aren't shown anything to substantially support this, but I guess it's not too weird. Now it's weird. What the fuck is this? Is this a little mucus tent it lays every night? Is it a nursery? You'd think a den would be a little more efficient than whatever this is. Not to mention they are at the mercy of any other predator or weather effect with no means of escape other than gnawing themselves out of the self-imposed trap. This just screams vaguely desertish ideas thrown together into a hat with no consideration whether this is a functional animal, and I haven't even mentioned the dew collecting ears. Listen, on paper, a surface that collects the morning dew, if sufficiently large enough, could very well satiate the thirst of these animals. However, the first issue I have is that this seems like a very small amount of water for a very active creature in an extremely hot environment. It just flat out isn't enough if it has to shit out a tent every morning, but even without it, I'd only accept this if they extract necessary moisture from their food, which is impossible if it is spice, and potentially lacking if it is a hardy animal. The second problem is the dew itself. With no surface water to evaporate, there must be an extremely tiny percentage of moisture in the air, certainly not enough to produce this kind of dew. There are no clouds on the sky, not even slivers, just a haze of dust. The atmosphere is, scientifically speaking, dry as fuck. Now, this animal is very clearly based off of jerboas. Naturally, those animals are herbivores, gain their water from the greenery they consume, are quick to escape predators, and do not shit tents. None of the adaptations clumsily stapled onto the jerboa make any sense, and they'd surely be unable to live on this planet outside of greenhouses. Definitely not long enough to develop detrimental or outright dysfunctional mutations that make their life even harder. Next time, maybe hire a guy who knows what they are doing to design your animals. We don't really see any other animals, but there's still the question of plants. So far we've only seen those in the garden and the hologram speaking about their cultivation by the Fremen. This is indeed the only correct way they can exist. Sand has none of the nutrients necessary for complex vegetation to grow, therefore fertilization is a must. Normally I'd suggest hydroponics, but on a planet with such scarce water resources, extremely deep roots are definitely the way to go, so props for that idea. This is proof for groundwater, by the way. For any civilization that cannot get sustenance from off-world, and for those who'd rather be self-reliant than throw money at the problem, agriculture is a mandatory activity, so I am glad this has been established for the Fremen. I'll throw a tantrum if I see white plants though. Somewhat linked to plants, another issue I have is with the oxygen levels. It's usually bad enough when planets have an atmosphere that exactly matches that of Earth, but this is a planet with no vegetation. Granted, cyanobacteria are far more important for filling the air with coveted O2, but those would have a hard time too. Since water is extremely far down, they'd have no access to the sun, making photosynthesis impossible. There are two ways molecular oxygen can still occur here though. For example, let's say for some reason the primordial Arrakis attracted a huge amount of O2 and somehow a significant portion of this remained in that state. But that also means life will suffocate in the not too distant future as there is no replenishment. Well, there kind of is with the second source. Ultraviolet light, something the planet has no shortage of, can break down carbon dioxide and produce O2 molecules and carbon atoms. However, this is an extremely slow process, far below what a mass of photosynthetic organisms could achieve, And with such massive consumers as the sandworms, this would likely be far below optimal. Indeed, another massive ecological catastrophe is coming in the form of inadequate oxygen levels, exponentially hastened by humans. Now, in and of itself, this is not an issue. We could very well have a planet with relatively common extinction events. That being said, I am very confident that this is not something that has been accounted for, and we won't see the detrimental effects such an accelerated consumption of the fragile atmosphere has. Indeed, we have not. I have no idea how long the Fremen or the Imperium have been here, but it was surely more than enough time to bring those levels a few percentage points lower, which would already have quite a ripple effect. This is definitely not something a person who isn't heavily invested in world building would see, therefore I guess I should not be too hard on people who get paid to do this for not doing it properly. Still, this is a fault in world building based on the information we've been presented, whichever way we look at it. Before we move on though, I must mention that designing any life for Arrakis is a difficult task. Spice makes it possible, but not easy. The way I see it, the place suffers from the very issue most sci-fi planets do, the thing I've already criticized. It is extremely one note for an entire globe. It has sand, spice and worms, that's pretty much it. Homogeneous, whereas it should not be. Even uninhabitable planets usually show some sort of diversity, let alone one that would be shaped by the very life it cultivates. Unfortunately, the world of Dune seems to be the definition of this trope. We have desert planet, water planet, evil planet, hell. We have an imperial army planet. Step 1 of how to make your massive universe seem extremely small. Anyway, we are still not done, which is hopefully not bad news for you. Let's see the next item, vehicles and transport. Alright, let's get the compliment out of the way. Attention to detail goes a long way, especially for world building. When we peer through the spacecraft that I assume serves as the gateway for faster than light travel, there's a planet there from a different part of the universe. It's barely noticeable and I absolutely love it. Well done. The fuck is this? Are you kidding me? This shit is the textbook definition of the rule of cool. The mentality of, it looks cool, don't care if it makes sense. I love dragonflies, but this degenerate's idea of an anisoptera makes my brain vomit through my eyes. Are you well versed in dragonfly aviation? Well, neither was I prior to writing this script. Here are 3 very informative free articles about the subject presented in a needlessly hostile tone. However, even without reading them, I had the massive IQ hunch that they don't just move their wings up and down. You know, like anyone above 5 would think so. If you grab 2 metal planks and flap them, no matter how fast you did, you remain on the ground and look like a stupid vet. But here's the kicker, almost every other piece of aircraft, even these giant boxes, just float. There's hover tech, lifting up anything from little drones, oh I'll get to you too, don't you worry, through fighter jets, to skyscraper-sized transport ships. Yet on a planet known for its sand and sandstorms, you want a malformed helicopter with large openings around its crucial mechanical parts, enormous wings that get in the way and are most definitely inadequate for gliding, and stuff that breaks off in a storm, which cannot even fly based on our knowledge of aviation. This piece of crap probably annoys me a lot more than it should. But man, do cool but retarded designs grind my gears. Also, the Harkonnen have the ability to turn theirs off remotely. They do so for the one that kidnapped Paul and his mom, but they'd sooner shoot an orbital laser at the one stolen by Equokal than flip a switch. I guess the story really needed that one, and consistency was sacrificed on the altar of convenience and bad writing. Speaking of bad writing, let's move on to harvesters. So they stroll around the desert, collecting spice, making rhythmic sounds. Judging by how a silly vogue can throw firms, I don't see why they are not designed to be arrhythmic, but let's assume that's not a possibility. Therefore, the monsters inevitably come. So what is the plan for that? Do you think the harvesters have a built-in device that lets them fly off? Maybe a piece of hover tech or just some balloons? Oh, of course not. Those balloons are separate and patrol the desert so that when a monster is spotted, you better pray to whatever deity protects you that there is a free one close enough. If you are lucky, it arrives in time and attaches securely using numerous connection points, so that multiple things have to go wrong for it not to be able to leave the harvester. Nah, I'm just kidding. There are 4 flimsy cords, and if one of them cannot attach on the first try, you are dead. Who designed this? I hope they weren't paid for it. Like, not only in-universe, but the writer who came up with this. It's abysmal. No one who has 2 brain cells to rub together thinks this is an efficient system. Also, they talk about being sabotaged, having to use faulty equipment left behind. And I have many questions. Why did they not bring their equipment? This doesn't even seem like one of the Harkonnen devices shown at the beginning of the movie anyway. Regardless, the Harkonnen are clearly evil and want you to fail. Maybe don't rely on their kindness and actually manufacture your own equipment. Maybe do more preparations than sending one dude to talk with the locals, you tactical genius. I need to calm my nerves, so let me bring up some good world building to at least partially counterbalance these atrocities. The building designs are excellent on Arrakis. Big, massive walls, low buildings, narrow window slits, almost subterranean. Exactly how I'd picture a purpose-built desert city, where energy is not just pumped into a million air conditioners. That's better. Here's one more. The Soundproof Veil. Excellent. I wonder why other sci-fi settings don't have something like this. Just a thing to make personal conversations impervious to spying. At this point, only planted bugs and the participants can hear stuff. And I'd assume that the signal of bugs is also cut off with this device. Great idea. Oh, look at that. I only had positives for the everyday technology part. Just 2, but still. Okay, what's next? Oh. I don't think I'm going to be the first person to criticize shields, or the last one for that matter. It's one of the selling points of the setting, yet also an aspect that thoroughly destroys it. I have no doubt in my mind that it was designed because Herbert wished to have sword fights in a futuristic setting. However, instead of making special melee weapons that are in some way better than guns, he tried to make guns ineffective and kept swords the same. To contrive a reason where medieval armaments are useful and firearms are not, he created his version of shields with a simple premise. Slow things can move through, fast things cannot. Everything else was built on this faulty foundation, and unfortunately, the additions aren't much better. This is the section where I will talk a bit about book stuff, as I have encountered some things I must address. Let's begin our final chapter for today's video. Before we get into the meat of this subject, let me point out that the portrayal of shields is wildly inconsistent. I understand that such an odd limitation is hard to work into a choreography, but oftentimes the actors seem like they don't really care about consistency, and the only difference between a strike that gets through a shield and one that doesn't is the CGI effect, not the speed. From a world building perspective, I'm willing to look over this, as this is more a failure of directing and not representative of what would actually happen in this setting. Still an issue, but a bit different. While we are at this scene, here's another prime example for the rule of cool. I don't care how much adrenaline is pumping through his veins. I don't accept this ordinary human to fight just as well with a gaping wound through his chest. That sword went through his heart, or at the very least left a deep cut, not to mention how his ribs were broken, or the fact that he pulled out something that must have been stuck pretty firmly in there. I get that you want to show how much of a beast he is, but no need to make him inhuman. Anyways, shields. What is the non-meta explanation behind the reason they let slow stuff through? This is not mentioned in the movie, but it is breathing, so that air can pass through. If only there was a way to extend the time you can spend without direct access to the atmosphere. I mean, I'd take an oxygen tank and be impervious to melee weapons too, or just a little tube or something. This is pretty bad justification. Since we are not told whether these shields have any other limit, like requiring to be charged with energy or the such, this pretty much breaks all warfare, as everyone can be immortal. Well, kind of, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. There are even more ways to circumvent mortality, like armor. There seems to be some form of protective gear, but as per Hollywood standards, they don't mean jack shit. Still, if someone had the inconceivable idea of wearing full plate with the shield, they are now immortal. Fast strikes cannot get through, and armor-piercing weapons are known to be reliant on that. Although this is assuming the shields would actually work the way they are depicted, there are quite a few issues with that too. It is difficult to gauge the limits of this device. If I hit someone fast, it gets stopped, but once it is stopped, the weapon is no longer fast, so does it get through? Cause it's pretty worthless if it does. Also, what is the extent of the field? Does it also cover the feet? If I were to jump quickly, would it activate and completely throw me off balance? Can I not grab stuff at a moment's notice? What if there is something on my belt I need to access quickly? Is my hand stopped by my own shield? Those are pretty distracting limitations, even if they do not outright make fighting impossible. To make matters worse, alternative weapons are ripe for abuse. It doesn't stop gas. We are shown that, and it wouldn't stop fire either. Even if the flamethrower fires fuel too fast, the heat will surely get me. If it was up to me, I'd do everything to avoid a fair melee, as should any tactician when equipping their soldiers. Also, kinetic force is still transferred to the target, at least partially. In this scene, the Thopter, man, even the name sounds stupid, is hit with a rocket, which knocks it out of its previous trajectory. Therefore, I need one guy with a rocket launcher to just blow an entire sword division apart. Even if they survive with a few bruises and broken bones, they are now disoriented, hurt, and out of formation, ripe for being picked off. Beside kinetic force, there's also light, which we can see passes through, as it is transparent. Laser weapons. We can even see them. Now, I know there is the worst imaginable reason given for why those are not used in the books. So let's explore that first. If a shield is hit with a laser, it detonates with the force of a nuclear bomb. However, there is a gentleman's agreement not to use that interaction. Yeah. God forbid my orbital laser nukes the place I want nuked with a single shot. That would be horribly dishonorable. Now let me break the neck of my ally next to the paralyzed body I'll proceed to gloat over. Seriously, this cannot be true, as it fundamentally breaks everything. Do you think the Fremen would not just shoot at that massive shield wall from afar to keep the Imperials away? Warfare would just default to sending drones with a small shield and a laser pistol into the heart of enemy forces and make it shoot itself. Boom. Everyone dead. Mutually assured destruction would not even be capable of stopping this, as just an everyday item and a handgun can cause a localized Armageddon. There's no detecting that one. Suicide bombers would be beyond dangerous. Such an interaction would simply make shields an extreme liability, not a mass-manufactured item paired with a pinky promise that others won't use it against you. This is asinine. How can you expect such a world to function? Imagine bulletproof glass imploding like a neutron star if you hit it with a laser pointer. Do you think we would have bulletproof glass then? Bloody hell, how is this an idea? However, to the movie's credit, this is most definitely not the case. They use this orbital laser against this mutant helicopter that clearly has a shield, and a device meant to cut through metal is also employed. This means such an interaction does not exist, as if it does, the Harkonnen are even more retarded than I thought. That being said, why are you not using these weapons? It is a device that makes enemy person go bye-bye if you pull the trigger. It is surely more effective than going into melee. Look, even the Fremen have some, so it cannot be expensive beyond the point of viability. Speaking of firearms, these seem awfully useful too. Not as good as laser, but it still gets through the shield. Maybe use them more widely. Also, if you see someone struggling with deflection, maybe shoot a few more times instead of sniffing glue. Shields seem more redundant with every item we introduce. There are also missiles. Some don't get through shields. Some are designed to do just that. Others aren't, but still inexplicably seem to be able to do that. I'd also sooner use those against infantry than a sharpened piece of metal that may or may not get through. It's really annoying to see such flimsy world building, as shields are meant to be a pivotal part of the setting, yet they absolutely make no sense. With just a bit of extra thought, they can be made indestructible, completely useless, or an outright liability. Not a state you want to have something in. I am sure there exists some scenario in which swords can be used to great effect on a futuristic battlefield. For example, I'm certain melee weaponry is far safer and more useful on claustrophobic spacecrafts, where a careless shot could lead to a damaged hull and direct access to the vacuum of space. However, there is no denying just how much better even modern firearms are than a sharpened stick, let alone sci-fi guns. The truth is that there are very few ways you can make them less effective than the armaments of yore, and Dune shields are definitely not the way to go. If they work how they are supposed to, they are overpowered. If they work like they are presented, they are completely useless. If they work like they do in the books, they are the equivalent of going into battle with a loaded gun pointing at your head, only it is loaded with a nuclear warhead instead of bullets. It seems like this was the last item on my list, and I managed to get every criticism I had into this video. It was quite a chunky one, so I'm not going to waste your time with a lengthy outro. But I guess I should say a few words about critiques. This is the third one I did. I know a couple of you are here for this kind of content, however rare it is, but I honestly cannot tell if they are going to be any more or less frequent. I need to feel motivation to undertake one of these projects, and as you can see by the trend, they are likely going to be quite long in the future. I'm probably not going to cover the second season of The Witcher, as I did not have the motivation to watch it in the first place. None of the ones I did so far were premeditated either, so you'll have to hope I see something particularly bad or brilliant if you like this content. Anyways, if you really did watch it this long, I really appreciate it, and I won't keep you up any longer. Hope to see you next time too. Bye!